You're listening to the Results Driven Organizations podcast with Dr. Tanya Lowe, a podcast of curated conversations with C-suite leaders and those who support organizational growth and development. Get ready for inspiring interviews, educational lessons, and thought-provoking discussions that will challenge you to execute something new and innovative that will drive results in your organization. And now, here's Dr. Tanya Lowe.
Hello, you're listening to episode 23 of the Results Driven Organizations podcast with Dr. Tanya Lowe. Using my results-driven philosophy of strategy, leadership, teams, and customer experiences, I help organizations develop their best kept secret, their human capital. This podcast is designed to expand the conversation with C-suite leaders and those who support organizational growth and development, and what it really takes to create, develop, and maintain results-driven and high-performing organizations. Our guest today is Marshall Taggart, Associate Vice President for Governmental Affairs for Clark Atlanta University's Institutional Advancement Division. Marshall is no stranger to leadership. He brings aviation leadership experience, national board member experience for several organizations. He served as adjunct professor of political science and business for 2 universities, as well as served in the Chicago Mayor's Office of Budget and Finance. Prior to joining Clark Atlanta University, Marshall was the first African-American CEO of the 4th largest airport based on enplanements for the Montgomery Regional Airport in Montgomery, Alabama. Marshall has a rich leadership background spanning government, corporate, community, academia, and aviation. Marshall is an alumnus of Clark Atlanta University, a proud member of Alphi Fraternity Incorporated, a husband, father, and a doctoral candidate. Marshall, welcome to RDO.
Thank you, Tanya. Appreciate that introduction. Boy, it didn't sound like I've done all those things, but I guess I have.
Yes, you have. So let's jump right in. You have a strong background in aviation, going back to aviation leadership, Chicago, Montgomery, DeKalb. Trace your steps from where you started to where you are today. Can you share with us some of the leadership lessons you've learned along the way that have been transferable to other industries? And then I got a part 2 question for that too.
Gotcha.
We got an A-B selection here.
That's a lot of parts in that question, but hey, I'll try to answer it. I'll start out kind of high level, 30,000 foot view, right?
Exactly.
6 airports being large hub, medium hub, and small hub. And when I say that, I'm talking about the number of passengers and the amount of complexities of the organizations, because of course the larger the organization, the more functional, but as well as specified in terms of specialties that you would have to have. So, but that may reek folks wanting to have territories and operate in silos. And so, as you get down to the smaller organizations, it's more of the interaction, the one-on-one interaction, the opportunity of understanding the dynamics and making opportunities to really put forth a mission and vision where people can get, because you're managing smaller teams, smaller groups. But I'll tell you, the commonality of it all is people. And trying to really understand how you can work with people, how people are motivated, how they in turn look at their jobs, how you can in turn keep individuals involved and engage. That is a challenge. And it takes a little bit, not just knowing the basic thing for a degree. I have a bachelor's in accounting and a master's in public administration. You and I both know we went to the Clark Atlanta University.
Absolutely.
And, we in turn have been trained, but it's the other things that you may not be familiar with. It's the psychology. It's having the empathy. It's having the compassion. It's also too being a servant leader and not looking to be served in these roles. And these skills come over time. It's not something that you're taught. It's something that you learn by experience, by trial and error. And so I've held a lot of progressive positions to become the CEO, Executive Airport Director. I've also too been the National Alumni Association President, volunteering at our institution. Mm-hmm. And that's where I really cut my teeth, to really understand about people, understand about people's motivations and what their motives and agendas are, and trying to make sure that their agenda lines up with your ultimate agenda, and that's to move the organization forward and have some progress and reach goals. The other component of that is really studying people and observing people. I've learned to do that a lot, do more listening, seeking first to understand, then to be understood.
Yes. And
more importantly, also too, listening from a perspective of getting general understanding about what are their true motivations, and where are their minds. It's not about trying to figure people out. It's really trying to understand where there's a meeting of the minds, and to understand people's core values, of respect, of understanding about. So it comes again from understanding people's core values, and you get understanding from core values by looking and observing individuals. And it's not a test. It's not a matter of putting people through these kind of like exercises. It's really just having the understanding emotional intelligence, having the emotional intelligence to be able to pick up on people's feelings, what motivates them, what are some of the challenges, resistance to change, understanding all these different facets of people. Because once you understand people, you know how to motivate and interact with them. And once you understand people's core values, you know, okay, this person may need a little bit more understanding about empathy for others. And learning about people's kind of personal backgrounds, not trying to be a psychologist of any type, but of course, if people have had issues with dealing with trauma, dealing with issues in terms of personal, whether it be verbal abuse or physical abuse or some type, you have to know people where they are, who they are, and then accepting that so you can in turn move forward with your mission and vision in an organization.
You know, Marshall, you've given our listeners so many amazing nuggets. And like you already answered the second part of my question, which was how important are emotional intelligence skills for leaders. And, you know, as you talked about so much, but I'm going to start with the last thing you talked about, you know, trauma, because life trauma can end up being workplace trauma. And so it is so important to understand people. I think that is probably the best transferable skill, is being not an expert, but just understanding people. We have to value people. So I love what you said about that. And listening more. We can, I think right before we started our conversation, we were talking about listening skills. And I had an opportunity where I was working with an organization and they weren't moving as fast as I felt that they could go, but I had to listen more. And so I ended up learning so much from that. You also talked about volunteerism. I think volunteerism is an amazing training ground for leadership. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I can. I think one thing about volunteering, people tend to say, well, I can divorce myself from being who I am in a volunteer environment versus what they consider a professional environment. Mm-hmm. You can't split yourself in two. You have to come as you are in both areas. You can't act more understanding and empathetic in a professional environment because that's where you receive your money or your check, versus you being in a volunteer organization. And so sometimes, you know, conflict is inevitable in organizations. And you have to learn to understand where people are, meet them where they are, and use that old adage again about having emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right. It is a training ground for you to understand, how you treat people in a volunteer organization is how you ultimately treat them in every aspect of your life, whether it be professional, personal. And you have to, I think, as African Americans, we have to really understand we do have traumas that were caused, from an ancestral standpoint, individuals. And so some of that trauma is passed on in our relationships, in our families. And so sometimes we don't clearly understand where this is coming from.
Right.
And so I've been called, anything under the sun, from the A word arrogant to the N word narcissist to anything under the sun about
right.
me.
Other than who you really are.
but some of it may or may not be warranted, right? So
right.
You get feedback from people. You have to be humble enough to understand, and then you also have to be humble enough to really go try to get help. So,
yes.
For me, I've been to therapy, still am in therapy to really help me to develop a better me.
Right.
Wow.
So
that's helpful for your mental health.
Yes. And I think it's so important. I'm so glad that you shared that. It's so important for leaders to be self-aware, to be open to feedback, not just take that position, well, I'm the leader and it's all about me, but really be open to feedback, because we are all in a place of growing. And the more we can grow, the better we can lead, I believe. And so that's going to lead me to my next question for you is, prior to COVID-19, leaders were faced with many challenges. What do you believe are the biggest challenges leaders face today? And do you have any suggestions for those leaders?
Well, pre-COVID, I think it was business as usual. I think some of the old management techniques, you remember these, Tanya, like management by walking around, total quality management, TQM, all these things that we've read about in terms of trying to structure the organization, basic things about organizational behavior, doing DISC assessments,
yes,
also doing 360 feedback, all these things that you've learned. Well, I tell you, COVID-19, all that went out the window, okay? Because particularly in an airport environment, you've seen your traffic decrease by 90%. And you've seen flights grounded where you have maybe one. And so you get into that situation, you have to really understand that all these factors associated with people's health, the mental stress that people come in, the dynamics change because people start to worry about it. It's, their families. They start to worry about the interaction if they're going to catch COVID. And some of them that did have COVID, you have to have a really understanding about, hey, it's not about the mission. Really and truly, it's about our people being healthy and how do we manage and maintain. Now, that doesn't help when you have individuals who don't prescribe to the science, don't prescribe to where you're headed. And so you're faced with challenges, insurmountable challenges of dealing with the change and dealing with the challenge of managing in a COVID environment. So that's the challenge. But the other piece of that is you begin to change yourself, change your approaches, and you also begin to reprioritize what really matters. Yeah. And that means people's lives. We didn't stop doing COVID. We didn't stop and work via Zoom. I mean, we had to be there face to face. And so keeping and making sure people were diligent about keeping their hands clean, wearing a mask. It was definitely a challenge to deal with.
Yeah. So do you have any, here we are almost 2.5 years post-COVID. or I don't know if we're post-COVID or just COVID, the next level, but do you have any recommendations for leaders who are struggling with this new this new world, because it's different? COVID changed. So much happened. Let's just go back to 2020. So much happened in 2020. We had the pandemic. We had racial injustice. We had, well, not like racial injustice had just started, but it was highlighted even more. We had people who had been tired for so long really start to feel the trauma of the workplace. There were so many things. And then, here we go into 2021, the Great Resignation. And so leaders are faced with so many things, so many challenges now, when, it was just we're going to coast, prior to COVID. So do you have any recommendations, maybe two or three recommendations for leaders to get their footing, who may be struggling with dealing with this new way of leading?
Well, I think most organizations are starting to move back into meeting face to face. But I think what really needs to take place is people need to acknowledge it, that there is a great resignation and people are not prone to deal with things that we've done that have happened in the past. I think people should realize that their approaches should be different. People need a lot more, I wouldn't call it, but call it a lot more understanding and awareness. That, sometimes this whole thing about us being at home, it may be a blessing in disguise to have flex time and to really embrace, non-traditional hours, and really providing an opportunity which I applaud our president here at Clark Atlanta, he's allowed families to be tested for COVID. Yeah. And so to me, that sends a message of caring, but also too, it releases anxiety of employees wondering, okay, I know I have to be tested, but then what about my family members who may not be in a role where they have to be exposed to those environments? I use my wife, Sherry, as an example. She's a school teacher.
Right.
And I'm not going to name the county, but some of these counties are whereby, the parents are pushing and saying, hey, we want them to have a traditional learning environment. And so do they have to wear masks? No, they don't. And so you have teachers standing in front of kids, basically putting themselves at risk, because the children, they don't know, they don't understand, and they touch and they feel, and they're involved with their teachers. So that level of anxiety, coupled with what may or may not be dealing with coming from working at home,
right? It raises
so it. Off of environments that have already been stressful enough, and then you're looking to go to another environment. But guess what happens? You still have the same issues at the house.
Right.
That doesn't change.
It does not change. It does not change.
So that heightens the mental anxiety. And so you, as a leader, you have to be aware that that's what your employees, that's what your colleagues are going through. And you have to have that empathy. So doing other things, going outside to have meetings, doing non-traditional things where you in turn are not necessarily being so demanding on deadlines, being a little fluid and working in smaller teams.
Yes.
Deal with issues and projects as opposed to having one person do it. If you have a finance issue, getting other people to work together as a group. Maybe your comptroller and your budget director maybe need to work a little bit more closely to analyze issues. That's important.
Right. Awesome. So you've shared so many nuggets with us today. It's so important for an organization to reach their organizational success, to surround themselves with people who will co-create with them to reach their highest pinnacle for the organization. And that's your team. What are some lessons that your team has taught you over the years?
Well, let's see. I would say do a little bit more listening. Stay engaged with people in terms of their issues and concerns. Be methodical sometimes in your approaches, but also too with some people being very direct and articulating your expectations. Not making excuses, but at the same time, having compassion for when things are not completed in a timely fashion, and learning to trust.
That's a big one. That's a big one for many leaders.
When you delegate, you got to give it away. And management is about delegating or delegation. But leadership is about delegating and letting go. And sometimes people can't let go. They can't let go of control.
Yeah. As I go into organizations and I help them with developing their leaders, and I hear that a lot, it's the trust. I don't trust that they're going to do it the way I would do it. And I was like, so when you retire in 2 years, in 3 years, who's going to be prepared to do what you do? So leadership is, okay, you've made it to this level, but who are you preparing? Who are you mentoring? Who are you modeling? Who are you allowing to learn?
You're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah. So, wow. Listening, engaging, being strategic, methodical, direct, expectations, compassion, and trust are the things that your team has taught you over the years. And I think those are some amazing lessons, because I know as I entered the workforce, I was always a team of one. I was the quarterback, the running back. I was all of those things until I got a team. And I struggled in that area, but I had to quickly learn to gain those skills. And it was no longer just about me. It was really about me helping my team members to be the best that they could be so that we could all succeed. So I love those things that you learn from your team. So final question, what are you reading that we should be reading?
Well, I am reading a book called Vernon Can Read. And the author is it's about the biographical component of Vernon Jordan. And what the revelation was, Vernon was as a young child growing up in Atlanta, he was a chauffeur to, I want to say, one of the Coca-Cola magnates.
Okay.
Woodruff, if I'm not mistaken. And he was the driver for him. And he just did not, when he asked Vernon a question about what school he was going to be going to, he ended up telling him DePaul University. And when he started having a conversation and he went into the man's study, he was picking up books and reading the books and talking about them and the central theme of the books. And so he said, Vernon, you can read.
Wow.
Well, I say all that because when you talk about organizations, people don't really know enough about people, right? Just like he was the employer of Vernon. And he made assumptions. He came conclusions about people. That book helped me is helping me to really understand about, in that case, because of racism and because of people thinking how people are and how people, they assume that people know. You can't do that in leadership. You can't make that assumption.
Right.
And going through my career, I made that same assumption that people was where I was. And so you have to accept people for who they are and where they are in their lives when you're managing people.
Absolutely.
That kind of taught me a lot about leadership and management from reading that book. I garnered that and just wanted to kind of equate that to our conversation today.
Oh, yes. And tell us the name of that book again. Burning.
It's Vernon, Bernon. Vernon Can Read.
Vernon can read. Vernon can read. Absolutely.
I didn't know he could read. That was the assumption that he made. And,
wow.
Vernon growing up in the 40s and the 50s, where most of our white brethren and sisters really assumed that all Negroes at that time were ignorant and couldn't read.
Right.
Couldn't feel and couldn't. But, everybody has feelings. Everybody has emotions. And that goes back to our comment about emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. So it's a very good book.
Awesome. Guys, we have been chatting with Marshall Taggart, Associate Vice President for Governmental Affairs for Clark Atlanta University, Institutional Advancement Division. He has shared some amazing nuggets with us today. And the highlight is really about people, really understanding people. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Visit the show notes to see how to connect with Marshall. Grab a copy of Results-Driven Organizations, the 4 Keys to a High-Performance Workplace, and our special gift for being a valued listener. Until next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Results Driven Organizations podcast with Dr. Tanya Lowe. Be sure to review the show notes for the resources mentioned, and don't forget to grab your free gift available at freegiftfromtanya.com. Until next time.